What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and welcome to our very first course here on Comics Explained. This is, of course, a course about mutants in Marvel Comics. And so in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to run over the X gene, what it is, how it works, as well as the new power hierarchy for mutants in Marvel Comics, i.e., who the most powerful mutants in Marvel are, and what it is that makes them so powerful. So, for a lot of you guys who are familiar with Marvel, you're going to hear some things you already know, and you're going to hear some things you don't know. But the easiest place to start here is answering the question, what's the difference between a mutant and a mutate? And the reason why I start there is because I've seen this question asked a lot. So the difference between these two is actually very, very simple. Mutants are individuals who gain their powers by way of the X gene. Mutates are individuals who gain their powers due to some external factor. A good example of this, Spider-Man being bitten by a radioactive spider. Now, the way their powers work is interesting because mutant and mutate powers are often kind of the inverse of each other. And what I mean by that is when mutant powers activate, and for mutant powers as a whole, very rarely are mutant powers predictable. No one really knows what kind of powers mutants are going to have. Mutates, on the other hand, have very predictable powers. Spider-Man being bitten by a radioactive spider, of course he would develop the proportional strength of a spider, wall crawling, things like that. It's not to say there are not exceptions. There's no way anybody could have known that when Bruce Banner was exposed to gamma radiation that he was going to turn into a giant green rage monster. So for every rule, there's an exception to the rule. With that out of the way, let's talk about the X gene. So in Marvel Comics, with mutants getting their powers from the X gene, the most logical question to ask here is, where did it come from and how does it activate? Well, let's start with the first part. So there's two explanations for where the X gene came from in Marvel. The most recent explanation actually involves something called the progenitor celestial. We're going to ignore that. The reason why is because Marvel seems to be ignoring it and slowly phasing it out. So we're going to go with the traditional explanation, which says that in the very early days of Earth, the Celestials visited Earth itself. The reason why is because they were traveling the universe, engaging in a kind of cosmic experiment, which is to say they were going to worlds and experimenting on those worlds' citizens. When they came to Earth, they took a group called the Wanderers, which were basically the missing link between primate man and modern man, and they split the Wanderers into three groups. The first group had their genes destabilized in such a way that not only would they develop any number of powers, but their physical appearance would also shift randomly as well from one generation to the next. This group became the deviants. Now, the second group had their genes modified so that they would basically be able to harness cosmic energy, and by all standards of measurement would be considered the perfect human. They became the Eternals. The third group had placed inside their genome a latent gene, which we call the X gene. Now, this is where a lot of people get tripped up, because what people try to do is they try to establish the idea of some kind of an inherent timeline, which is to say the gene was deposited, the clock starts. That's not how it works. There was no countdown to when the gene was going to activate. It just activated one day. Ironically enough, when the Celestials were conducting this experiment, the kind of perfect being they were shooting for actually turned out to be Franklin Richards, which we'll talk about later on in this video. But the important thing here is this. Once the groups were experimented on, they were just kind of set out into the world. Because the Earth's population was so small then relative to what it is now in Marvel Comics, the X gene didn't activate all that frequently because there were so few people who had it. That's the reason why, as the population of Earth grows in the Marvel Universe, you can actually trace the increased activation of the X gene proportionally to the Earth's population growing. But after this X gene was introduced to society, what you got was a kind of history and to a degree a bit of a timeline. Now, we will have an actual lesson that covers the full timeline of mutants in Marvel Comics from this particular origin running all the way up to the modern day. As far as the X gene itself and the activation process, which is what I want to transition into in this segment, there are three ways in which the X gene activates. The first one is the most common one, and it happens 99% of the time, which is puberty. Why? Because in the astonishing X-Men comics, one of the things we learned from Beast is that the X Factor gene is actually on the 23rd chromosome, which is the gene that's responsible for the determination of whether or not a person is male or female within Marvel Comics. And when the body goes through the process of preparing itself for reproduction, which you and I call puberty, those genes effectively become dominant. And that's when the X gene kicks in. But the other thing about this is that when it comes to the X gene being passed on from parent to child, there is no guarantee that the X gene will successfully be passed on. A good example of this is the character Fei Long from the Iron Man comics. He had a vendetta against the mutant population because his parents were mutants, but he was born without the gene. There's seemingly no real rhyme or reason why it happens, and the X gene kind of seems to fall rank and file with dominant and recessive genes within the human genome as they're passed on from one generation to the next. But after puberty, you have what's called moments of high duress. And moments of high duress is usually what you see when a mutant power activates either before puberty or sometime after puberty because the gene didn't activate during puberty. Now, a really good example of a mutant power activating later on in life due to a moment of high duress is Magneto. Magneto's powers activated at the end of World War II, or at least after World War II, when he and his wife Magda had taken up residence in a small town using fake identities. That Magneto and Magda had a daughter named Anya, and that Magneto, working for just some local employer there, found out that his boss was cheating him out of money. In a fit of rage, due to a combination of factors, most likely the PTSD stemming from his experience in the concentration camps of World War II, the fact that he had a family to feed and didn't know how he was going to do it, knowing he was getting ripped off, his powers activated and he flung a crowbar across the room. Ultimately, he ends up leaving, but by the time he gets back home, the local people had learned that he had powers. Considering him a freak, they'd actually set his house on fire while he was gone, and his daughter Anya burned to death. Magneto, of course, in turn, killed everybody who was there, and then Magda ended up taking off with Magneto totally unaware of the fact that she was pregnant with Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. She gave birth to the twins in Wundagore Mountain, and the rest is history. But the third method of activation in Marvel Comics, which rarely ever happens, is external activation, meaning somebody flicks on a person's X gene for whatever reason. A really good example of this, which is actually a character that we're going to talk about later on in this video, is Exodus. His powers were activated by the villain Apocalypse when Exodus first encountered Apocalypse during the Crusades. Ultimately, a kind of battle between them ensued, and then Apocalypse defeated him, most likely due to the fact that Exodus hadn't quite gained fine control over his abilities, and Exodus was locked away for a few hundred years until he was accidentally unlocked, or at least unleashed, and then became one of Magneto's acolytes in Marvel Comics of the 1990s. But nonetheless, these three methods are the only real methods that you're ever going to see for mutant activation within Marvel Comics. And that takes us into this kind of hierarchy when it comes to these powers. And so the first thing that you really start off with here are what are basically your gamma level mutants, right? These are your super low level guys. These are the folks who have some kind of mutation that most likely changes their physical appearance, but there really isn't anything else that comes out of it besides that. So if anything, their mutant power is more of a hindrance than anything else due to the fact that they're easily identifiable as a mutant, but they don't really have enough power to like scare people away. After that, you have what are called beta mutants. And for the longest time, I always struggled to find some kind of strong definition for what a beta mutant was, but recently I stumbled upon a definition that I really like, and it's one that we're going to use here, that a beta mutant is basically an alpha mutant with some kind of a drawback. A really good example of this, and one that's used fairly often within the fan base, is Cyclops. Now, I'm sure some people are going to say, oh, boo hiss, but hear me out here. Cyclops is, by all rights, an alpha level mutant. But what's the drawback? When Cyclops was younger, he hit his head, and that took away his ability to control his optic blast, because Cyclops' eyes are portals to a dimension of pure concussive energy. So when he opens his eyes, all that energy comes pouring out. It's why he has the visor. One, because it allows him to basically look around without having to worry about blowing somebody's head apart. And two, the visor actually allows him to control the size and shape of the beam. Everything from some super thin, basically razor thin blast that can just slice mountains in half to just like a giant concussive force, like being hit with a giant fist. And so if Cyclops had never hit his head as a child, he would be able to control his optic blast. And while it wouldn't make him the most powerful mutant in existence, it would move him up to the status of an alpha level mutant. Now, a good example of an alpha level mutant is somebody like Bishop. Bishop has the ability to absorb any and all forms of energy that are fired at him outside of physical strength, I believe, and then turn that energy into concussive blasts, or use that energy for a variety of effects. He can heal himself, different things along those lines. Now, as we get into Omega level mutants, what I want to do is I want to take a second and talk about the infinite nature of powers in Marvel Comics. The reason why is because before Jonathan Hickman stepped in and basically restructured the way that Omega level mutants work in Marvel Comics, there wasn't really any clear-cut definition to it. Instead, we as fans kind of had to create our own definitions, and these included anything from an Omega level mutant is a mutant powerful enough to destroy the world, to an Omega level mutant is a mutant whose powers operate on a galaxy-wide or even universe-wide scale. And so when it comes to powers, there really is no limit to the way powers work. That a telepath, for example, an Omega level telepath, could do anything from putting a subliminal thought into a person's head, convincing them that they're a cat, and having them walk around on all fours for the rest of their life, to potentially communicating with other beings in different universes. Now, we've never really seen an Omega level telepath do that, stand on Earth and communicate with somebody telepathically in a whole different universe. But the potential is that they could. And so what Jonathan Hickman did when he basically came back and restructured Omega level mutants is he said, every power is limitless. There's no limit to what can be done with any particular power. The definition of an Omega level mutant is in this lane of telepathy. And of all the mutants that exist that have telepathy, who's done the most? Who has achieved and has the most fine-tuned control over their telepathy? And those two people that we'll talk about here in a second, those are your Omega level telepaths. And so it's really interesting in terms of how it works, because you can almost imagine mutant powers being like a highway with however many lanes there are for mutant powers. There's a lane for reality warping, a lane for super strength, there's a lane for weather manipulation and temperature manipulation, and so on and so forth. What I'll also specify here is we do have a whole playlist on YouTube that goes through basically Omega level mutants and Omega level threats. Omega level threats basically being non-mutants who are equal to Omega level mutants in power. We also threw some DC characters in there just for the sake of it and called them Omega level threats. But going into this list, we kick things off with Joshua Foley. Now, Joshua Foley is a character named Elixir, and he has what's called biokinesis. Basically, he can manipulate the molecular structure of matter, but only as it relates to the human body of another person. Now, in years past in Marvel Comics, he had to physically touch a person in order to utilize his powers. But in Uncanny X-Men Volume 4 in 2017 from Cullen Bunn, he actually gained the ability to use his powers without physically touching people. Not only that, in issues 1 through 5, he was actually killed by a group called the Dark Riders, and in Uncanny X-Men Volume 4, Annual Number 1, he resurrected himself from the dead, and in doing so, his powers were amplified. And so in the modern era of Marvel Comics, Joshua Foley can do everything from shut a person's powers off, turning a person's powers on. He cannot grant people different powers, so he can't change the powers of Cyclops. He can heal anybody from anything. He can resurrect seemingly an endless number of people. We know that from Uncanny X-Men Volume 4, that particular Annual Number 1. He tried to resurrect all the mutants that were killed in Cassandra Nova's attack on Genosha. He wasn't really able to do it, but it was less due to the nature of his powers and more due to the fact it just took more concentration and energy that he had. But it was Marvel establishing he will be able to do that at some point in time. But he also has the ability to siphon the life force off of people. And so as time progresses for the character of Joshua, he'll literally become this kind of godlike mutant that can kill or create life as he sees fit. We're waiting to see when that time comes, if it ever comes in Marvel Comics, but that takes us into the next person on the list, which is Gabriel Summers. Now, Gabriel Summers is the third brother of Cyclops, and he uses the name Vulcan. He has what's called energy manipulation, meaning he can manipulate any and all forms of energy, which include the electromagnetic spectrum, the same power that Magneto uses. And that Vulcan has used these powers powers for a wide array of different effects. It's not as grandiose as some of the other people on this list because there aren't very many people within the energy manipulating spectrum that are close to what Vulcan's been able to pull off. But by being able to manipulate energy, this guy can do things like heal himself. He can give himself any number of traditional superhero powers, right? So super strength, speed, different things like that. We can largely surmise that given his ability to manipulate power, he can do things like manipulate the power cosmic of Galactus. We don't know if that's for sure. We've never actually seen it done. There's no reason to believe that he could not. But given the ability for him to manipulate energy, he can push his levels of strength, speed, and durability way beyond most characters that are out there. In fact, I don't know that we've seen a story where Vulcan has fought the Incredible Hulk, but he would easily be able to hold his own against someone like the Hulk. Now, of course, the longer the Hulk gets angry, the more powerful and stronger he becomes. So eventually it would reach a point where Vulcan just couldn't keep up. But the next person on our list is Hope Summers. And Hope Summers has what's called power mimicry. In effect, Hope Summers can duplicate the powers of other people, but her power cannot be copied. So think of her as like a more powerful version of Rogue. Now, there are three things that come along with her powers. The first of these is that when Hope Summers copies the powers of another person, she immediately knows how to use those powers. Whether she's seen those powers used or not is irrelevant. The second thing is that when she copies those powers, she uses them in the most extreme, regardless of how that person has used their powers in the past. The third thing that comes out of this is Hope Summers' powers are limited to other mutants, meaning she cannot copy the powers of the Incredible Hulk and then immediately become the most angry the Incredible Hulk could theoretically ever become. But the drawback to Hope's powers is that she can only do this so long as that mutant stays in her vicinity. If they leave, she can still copy those powers, but the influence of those abilities and the potency of those abilities begin to fade over time. This is kind of a check and balance that Marvel put in so that while Hope Summers can duplicate seemingly an infinite number of powers, she cannot hold on to them forever and then just basically become God. But that leads us into Magneto, and I don't really feel like Magneto needs a huge amount of explanation here. He manipulates the electromagnetic spectrum, he's incredibly powerful, incredibly capable, but he's only one of like a couple characters that can actually manipulate magnetism the way that he does and has that particular power. Technically, it falls within the power set that Vulcan has, so Vulcan can actually manipulate Magneto's powers and then seemingly overpower Magneto with his own powers. But Polaris, the other daughter of Magneto, second to Scarlet Witch, is really the only other person in Marvel that can manipulate magnetism anywhere near the same level that Magneto can. But he's still more powerful than she is, and so that's the reason why he's Omega level. It's not to say he doesn't deserve that title. The guy's done some pretty incredible things, EMPing the world, things like that, pulling a giant bullet from space. He's done all kinds of crazy stuff in Marvel. But given the lack of available options for people that can manipulate magnetism, Magneto ends up as an Omega level mutant on the list. And so this takes us into David Haller, also known as Legion, which, by the way, had to re-record. Didn't really like the way this last part came out originally. But Legion has what's called dissociative identity disorder, which you and I know as multiple personality disorder. But through this, he has what Marvel calls power manifestation. Why? Because Legion's personalities manifest randomly more often than not, and each one of these manifestations has a power. Now, one of the things about this is not every personality has a unique power, which is to say some of these personalities have the same powers. What keeps this character interesting is that while two personalities may have the same power, they don't use that power the exact same way. Now, Legion having these differing personalities and the powers that come with it allow him to run the gamut on abilities in Marvel. He has everything from the Susan and Sunshine personality that can manipulate people's emotions, all the way up to the Moira personality that can reality warp on a localized space, literally affect the entirety of the Earth itself. But Legion cannot fully control these personalities and by extension, the powers that they have. But it has been theorized in Marvel that if Legion were able to find a way to control every single one of these personalities and all the powers that came with them, he would be a nigh unstoppable force in Marvel Comics. Now, David Haller himself is also incredibly powerful, right? He's an immensely powerful telepath. And that actually brings us into our Omega level telepaths. Now, I'm going to be a little bit dangerous on this one. Jonathan Hickman specifies that the Omega level telepaths in Marvel Comics were Jean Grey and Quentin Quire. Now, more recently, Marvel's actually adjusted Jean Grey to establish that she's also an Omega level telekinetic, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, as well as bringing in Cassandra Nova as a tried and true Omega level telepath. But regardless of how you slice it, I would argue that Jean Grey and Quentin Quire being Omega level telepaths has less to do with their powers and has more to do with the respective roles or the established nature of their characters. And here's what I mean by that. Quentin Quire is only an Omega level telepath because he took a drug called Kick, which amplified his abilities, but it was a permanent adjustment to his powers. So Marvel effectively just kind of rolls it all into one package and says he's an Omega level telepath. He is incredibly powerful as a telepath, so much so that he was able to seize control of the entire Xavier Institute and actually orchestrate a kind of rebellion against Xavier himself, who was basically powerless to stop it. For Jean Grey, she is a host for what's called the Phoenix Force. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what the Phoenix Force is, the Phoenix Force is the sum total of all life that has ever, currently does, or will ever exist across the multiverse and even the Omniverse. The Omniverse being a collection of multiverses, and it includes DC Comics multiverse and all that stuff. But the kicker about this is that when Jean Grey utilizes the full totality of the Phoenix's powers, she becomes the White Phoenix of the Crown, meaning she can destroy life, she can create life, she can wipe out whole universes, create whole universes. That was all established in a story called Here Comes Tomorrow by Grant Morrison, which kind of brings us back to Quentin. Because what that story also did is it established that Quentin Quire will become a host for the Phoenix. Now, there's a big difference between being destined to be a host of the Phoenix Force and just like having the Phoenix Force. Rachel Summers, Emma Frost, those folks have had the Phoenix Force. Jean Grey and Quentin are destined to be hosts for it. So they're meant for that. Now, I would say that's really the big thing that separates Jean and Quentin from seemingly everybody else and why they're Omega level mutants. Because the reality here is if you look at somebody like Charles Xavier or you look at someone like Emma Frost, over the years in Marvel Comics, outside of a few instances where Xavier would make an offhanded remark in saying Jean Grey's powers are incredibly high up there and they're ever growing, that by and large, there's been times where she's been weaker than Charles Xavier. And there's been times where she's been way more powerful than Xavier. There's been times where Emma Frost has been able to go toe-to-toe with Jean, and there's been times where Jean has shut Emma Frost down. Someone like Emma is a little more intriguing because what had happened in Immortal X-Men number 4, I believe it was that she had actually made the statement that the difference between herself and Jean, and presumably the reason why Jean is Omega level and Emma Frost herself is not, is because Emma uses her powers on a more subtle level, and she uses those to influence the fears of people, to control them, and get them to do what she wants them to do. Whereas Jean Grey uses her powers based on empathy. So her desire is to help people, and helping people takes a lot more work than not helping people. And so it usually pushes her powers to the extreme fairly consistently, meaning she has to compensate, learn to use her powers in new ways, and so her powers grow in ways that Emma Frost's powers don't. But again, one of the big things about the Omega level telepaths is that Jonathan Hickman didn't really give us a clear and concise reason why. It was simply just, they are. And so that's it. But that takes us into your kind of interesting Omega level mutants, Storm and Iceman. Now, Storm and Iceman are Omega level mutants, if for no other reason than the fact that they're kind of islands unto themselves in terms of how their powers work. No one manipulates cold the way that Iceman does, and no one manipulates weather the way that Storm does. Now, what is kind of cool is more recently there was a story where Thor fought Storm. He's fought her a bunch of times, but there's one instance where she tries to use her powers on him. And he says, like, I am the god of the lightning. It answers me before it answers you. And like, it's really cool. It's a really, really interesting scenario between the two. It's a great exchange. But kind of getting back on track here, because they're so unique in terms of what they do, there aren't really any people who are in their lanes of mutant powers. And so if for no other reason than the fact that they really kind of are lone individual power wielders out there, they're effectively Omega level. But it's not to say they don't deserve it. In Uncanny X-Men issue number 314, it was established when Emma Frost took over the powers of Iceman that he could actually destroy the world by freezing it down to its core and stopping the Earth from spinning. He can actually freeze people all the way down to the point that they shatter. He can lower the temperature around himself and anybody who's around him, and because of the absence of heat, he can actually see their body temperatures in infrared. More often than not, you don't really see his powers used in any of these meaningful ways. Instead, it's usually him just creating ice slides, right, and like freezing stuff up. But to give you guys perspective on how durable his ice is, this guy has used his powers to encase the Incredible Hulk, and the Hulk couldn't break out of his ice structure. So again, it's no small thing. Storm, again, very similar to Iceman, manipulates weather, and she can do this anywhere. She can do it on other planets. She can manipulate cosmic storms in space. She can control any and all weather phenomena, regardless of where it is that she happens to be. But that takes us into our telekinetics, matter manipulators, and reality warpers. Now, the reason why I lump all these together, really more telekinetics and matter manipulators than reality warpers, is because for an advanced enough telekinetic, they are not different from a matter manipulator. And here's the reason why. One of the most common questions that I see is people ask, what is the difference between a person who can manipulate matter and a person who can alter reality? The practical display of these powers shows no real difference between the two. They look the exact same in terms of how Marvel shows them being used within the comics. But in terms of the functional difference, it's all the difference in the world. So matter manipulators are constrained by the laws of physics, that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It has to go somewhere. Reality manipulators can defy the laws of physics, and we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. For someone like Exodus, who is a telekinetic, this guy has done everything. He can really control matter on the atomic and subatomic level. Now let's take that information and transition it to someone like Absalom Mercator, Mr. M, who is a matter manipulator. All matter manipulation does is it takes what's already there and restructures it. So let's say that, for example, Mr. M saw a teapot, and he wanted to turn this teapot into a car, a fully functioning, working car. Well, to get a little technical here, let's say the teapot has 1,000 atoms, and the car has 10,000 atoms. In order for him to make up that difference, constrained by the laws of physics, he's going to have to pull those other 9,000 atoms from somewhere. Now, he can pull them from the ambient air, he can pull them from a mountain, he can literally disintegrate people and pull it from them. But then he can take those atoms, add it to the teapot, and then turn it into a fully functional car. A telekinetic, someone like Exodus, is one credible story arc away from being able to do that, being able to rearrange subatomic particles to achieve virtually any effect. Would it make him as powerful as a reality manipulator? Absolutely not. And the reason why is because when it comes to reality manipulation, like I said, you're not constrained by the laws of physics. But there's two types of reality manipulators. Those who do it on a local space, so basically their immediate vicinity or potentially just Earth, and then those who can do it on a universal scale. Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, is the only individual who can do it on a universal scale. The two reality warpers who do it on a localized scale are Jamie Braddock and Proteus. Now, Proteus, Kevin McTaggart, is really interesting because he's technically a being made of pure energy. What he has to do is jump from one host body to the next to keep himself alive in a physical form. If there was no human body for him to jump into, he would just turn into like pure energy and, I don't know, transcend to a higher state of entropy. There's been a few stories in Marvel Comics where that's almost happened and he wasn't able to return to a physical form, so he would be effectively dead as far as you and I were concerned. He would just become one with everything. But when it comes to the use of his powers, he feeds on life energy and psychic energy, and that's why he burns those bodies out. But he can alter reality in a local space, and he can do anything. It doesn't matter. Using that example of the teapot and the car, he can just turn the teapot into a car. He doesn't have to pull the atoms from anywhere else. He can defy the laws of physics and just do that. But again, it's only in a local space. Jamie Braddock is really, really cool because he doesn't see the world the same way that you and I do. Sure, he would see me the way that you see me, but he would see strings attached to me all over the place. And these strings would cover everything that makes me who I am and what I look like. So the strings influence my hair color, my eye color, the sweater that I'm wearing, the color of my skin. And he could pull on each one of those strings and change those things. Now, it's not matter manipulation, it's not an illusion. So if he pulled on the strings of this set and changed this room to a black and white set like that it wouldn't simply just be matter manipulation and an illusion. That's really the reality in which I am in now, right? It is inescapable. There's nothing I can do to stop it. Now, the caveat to this is it is local. So we can't pull on a string and change the entirety of the universe. It's only in the immediate vicinity that he's in. But he can also do this to create alternate dimensions. He can do this to shut people's powers off, turn people's powers back on. He can do this to take away their powers permanently, right? Like literally deactivate their X gene forevermore. If you can imagine it within your immediate sphere of influence, he can do it. And that takes us into Franklin Richards. Franklin Richards, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this video, was kind of everything the Celestials were hoping for when they first deposited the X gene into the human race. They were looking for this perfect being that had the ability to alter reality the same way they could, that could actually supersede their power and had no drawbacks. And Franklin Richards has no drawbacks. And the reason why I say that is when Franklin was a little kid and his powers were manifesting, there were instances where he would age himself into an adult, right? Different things like that. And Reed Richards, right, his father, realized that with his son having these incredible reality warping powers, but being so young, that he could just arbitrarily and accidentally change the entire physical structure of the universe, maybe to turn it into a cartoon or like a giant episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. And so to prevent the imagination of a child from wiping out all of creation, Reed Richards put mental blocks in his mind to keep his powers from activating, with the exception of certain circumstances. Some of these circumstances being things like when all the superheroes died fighting Onslaught and Franklin Richards brought them all back to life and put them in a pocket universe that he carried around, which was about the size of a bowling ball. That was called Heroes Reborn. When the heroes returned, it was called Heroes Return. But there was also another instance when Galactus died, and then this being called Abraxas, kind of this multiversal force of destruction, arose in the aftermath of Galactus's death. In order to defeat Abraxas, Franklin Richards had to resurrect Galactus from the dead. And little displays of power like this, or at least grand displays on a relatively small scale in Marvel Comics, is what has really made Franklin Richards so incredibly powerful. And a lot of the work that we saw in relation to how powerful he could become was done in Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run. Over the course of that run, you learned things like Galactus is afraid of Franklin Richards' powers and what he can do. We learned that Franklin Richards from the future, when he came to the present day and unlocked the mental blocks in his younger self and allowed his powers to run free and then started teaching him how to use his powers, that he was deemed to be beyond Omega level classification, as it was explicitly stated. He was the most powerful and is the most powerful being in existence. And as a really cool display of his power, in the aftermath of Secret Wars 2015, when the multiverse was destroyed, that what Franklin Richards, working alongside the Molecule Man Owen Reese, who is a non-mutant that is astronomically powerful, as well as Reed Richards, they actually started working in order to bring the multiverse back. That the Molecule Man was effectively the wellspring of energy, right? He provided the infinite energy they needed in order to restore the multiverse. Franklin Richards, as a universal shaper, gave the universes their individual shapes and forms. And then Reed Richards, due to how smart he is and the fact that he remembers everything, restored all the universes to how they were supposed to be. And they were just literally shot out like bowling balls, right? Cannons, just being sent out into oblivion in order to take their place within the multiverse. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this lesson to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, make sure you guys drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.